Vivian was different. She was as flawless as ever. Her cream cashmere dress hugged her slender frame. The diamond necklace she wore reflected the cold, overhead lights of the conference room. The scent of expensive French perfume drifted lightly in the air. Whitmore Holdings will assume the entire debt if this marriage goes through. Her voice was chillingly calm, as if she were reading the acquisition terms of a five-star hotel, not deciding a human being's life. In return, they require a private, family-only marriage. I looked at the contract in front of me. Confidential, marital agreement. A confidential marital agreement, not a proposal, not love. Just a financial agreement written in legal jargon. I didn't ask who the man was. I knew immediately that I was the one being sacrificed. Not Vanessa Hayes, the biological daughter Vivian, always paraded around charity galas on the Upper East Side. Not the girl who got to wear haute couture and smile for the cameras alongside New York's elite. But me, Nora Hale, the most dismissible stepchild in this house. My father finally spoke after nearly 5 minutes of silence. "You don't have to decide tonight, sweetheart." Vivian turned to look at him as if she had just heard something absurd. "We don't have time, Daniel." Her voice dropped. "The banks will freeze our accounts on Monday morning." My father went silent again. What chilled me the most wasn't this marriage. It was that no one in this room thought there was anything wrong with it. I signed the contract at 11:12 p.m. No one said thank you. No one... Vivian simply slid the folder back to her side, then stood up and adjusted her cuffs as if she had just wrapped up a highly productive business meeting. "The Whitmore estate will pick you up tonight." Tonight, not next week. Not tomorrow. I almost laughed. My life wasn't even important enough to be put on hold until morning. The black Whitmore SUV was waiting in the lobby of the Windsor Palace Hotel close to midnight. The driver in a black suit got out to open the door for me, his composure flawless, typical of someone accustomed to serving the ultra-wealthy. Outside, it was -2 degrees. Snow blanketed the marble steps leading up to the hotel. Even at midnight, New York remained as bright as a massive stage where millions of people went about their lives, completely unaware that someone had just been traded away in a room high above them. I slid into the back seat. My phone buzzed twice. The first text was from my father. "I'm sorry." Just those 2 words. I stared at the screen for a long time before turning it off. The second text was from Vivian. "Don't embarrass the family any further." I let out a soft laugh. The sound felt completely out of place in the luxurious cabin, which smelled of expensive leather. The driver watched me through the rearview mirror for a few seconds before slipping back into silence. Perhaps he had seen plenty of women get into this car with that exact same look in their eyes. Those who were brought into the world of the rich for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with love. The SUV pulled away from Manhattan at 12:06 a.m. The snow grew heavier along the Hudson River Drive. Yellow streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching into blurred streaks of light beneath the tires. I watched the city slowly fade away behind the tinted glass. Part of me still felt like this was too absurd to be real. Just 6 hours ago, I was still reviewing a compliance audit for a logistics company in Boston. Now I was on my way to live with a man I had never even met. A billionaire who owned a chain of 5-star hotels stretching from New York to California, Adrian Whitmore. Even his name sounded so distant. 35 minutes later, the SUV turned into the quiet neighborhood of Greenwich, just outside the city. Massive, old money estates sat far apart, separated by vast, snow-covered lawns. Pale yellow garden lights cast soft glows on perfectly manicured trees. I used to think people living in places like this must be incredibly happy. I stopped believing that when I was 16. The iron gates of the Whitmore estate glided open almost silently. The mansion that appeared ahead was much larger than I had imagined. It had classic European gray stone walls and towering 2-story windows. Soft yellow light glowed from the rooms amidst the snowy night. It was beautiful, yet utterly cold. There was no music. There were no voices. No signs of life, No indication that this was a place where a real family actually lived. An elderly housekeeper was waiting for me right by the front door. She had silver hair neatly pinned into a bun, and a voice so soft it almost melted into the air. "I am Eleanor. Your room is ready, Miss Nora." No one said, "Welcome home." Strangely enough, I had still hoped to hear it. Inside, the mansion was so quiet that our footsteps echoing across the marble floor sounded like walking through a five-star hotel after midnight. Antique oil paintings hung neatly along the walls. Vases of fresh white flowers had just been set out. The scent of oak wood and the warmth of flawless golden lighting filled the space. Everything was beautiful, but there was no warmth. A real home always shows signs of life. A jacket left draped over the sofa, a half-empty glass waiting to be taken to the kitchen, the faint murmur of a TV playing somewhere in the background, a sudden laugh echoing down the hallway. There was none of that here. The whole place felt more like a luxury hotel than a home to return to after a long day. Eleanor led me past the main dining room. A long table, draped in white linen under a crystal chandelier, could easily seat 14 people. The silver cutlery cast a cold reflection across the surface. Not a single chair was pulled out. There was no sign this room had ever hosted a real family dinner. "Mr. Adrian is still working tonight." That was the first time I had heard my husband's name since we signed the marriage certificate. "Does he always work this late?" "Very late." Eleanor didn't say another word. She led me to the second floor down a hallway so long that our footsteps echoed, sounding like an old hotel in Chicago. My bedroom was almost as large as the entire apartment I used to rent when I first started working. A king-sized bed was made up with crisp, cream-colored sheets. Massive glass doors looked out over the snow-covered garden behind the estate. Resting on the sofa by the window were several outfits, all tailored perfectly to my measurements. Everything was so perfect. But that perfect hospitality only made me feel like a freshly delivered package, rather than someone starting a new life. Eleanor wished me good night and left. The heavy door clicked shut. I stood alone in the middle of the cavernous room, listening to the winter wind rattling softly against the glass. I had no idea what Adrian Whitmore liked to eat, or what his laugh sounded like, or how his voice changed when he was angry. I hadn't even seen his face. Sitting down on the edge of the mattress, I slipped off the high heels that had been pinching my feet all day. The room fell back into an unsettling silence. Then, I noticed the only sign of light left in the mansion. A soft glow coming from downstairs. I slipped back out into the hallway just before 1 in the morning. A pale band of warm light stretched from the bottom of the stairs across the first floor. The massive kitchen was still lit up. The low hum of an espresso machine hummed softly in the quiet air. I still hadn't seen him, but for the first time since stepping inside the Whitmore estate, curiosity got the better of me. Why would someone living in such a flawless world lie awake night after night? I met Adrian Whitmore for the very first time at exactly 5:58 the next morning. Outside, the sky was still pitch black. Behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, the snow-covered garden caught the pale yellow light of the lawn lamps, casting cold, fractured shadows across the drifts. I had barely slept a wink, and it wasn't because the bed felt unfamiliar. It was because this villa was so quiet. It made me feel like an uninvited guest who had accidentally wandered into someone else's life. By nearly 6 in the morning, I finally gave up. I changed into a light gray sweater, pulled my hair up, and headed downstairs in search of coffee. The low hum of the espresso machine drifted out before I even fully stepped into the kitchen. A man was standing with his back to me. He wore a black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, broad shoulders. His posture was perfectly straight. He was the kind of person who could command a room just by standing still, making everyone else instinctively lower their voices. He turned when he heard my footsteps. That was the first time I saw Adrian Whitmore. He wasn't like the men who appeared on the cover of Forbes, with their perfect smiles and superficial eyes. Adrian had sharp, angular features, cold, but not entirely emotionless. His gaze was incredibly still, like a winter lake that had been frozen over for so long no one knew what lay beneath the ice. He looked at me for a few seconds, no smile, no greeting, just observing. "Did I wake you?" His voice was so deep and calm, it almost blended into the hum of the espresso machine. "No, I couldn't sleep anyway." Adrian gave a slight nod, as if it didn't really matter. "The coffee is in the cabinet on the left." Then he turned back to the open laptop on the kitchen island. The screen reflected cold blue financial spreadsheets onto his face. I opened the cabinet and took out a white ceramic mug. The kitchen was larger than my entire first apartment in Boston. The light gray marble countertops were so spotless, there wasn't even a single water spot. Even the aroma of the coffee smelled expensive. I brewed myself a cup and stood by the glass doors, watching the snow fall in the garden. The entire kitchen fell into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but felt incredibly distant. Margaret mentioned you used to do compliance audits for Sterling Transit. I turned to look at him. "Yeah, have you quit yet?" "Not yet." Adrian typed a few lines on his laptop before continuing. "You should resign soon." The way he spoke was strange. It wasn't a command. He simply sounded like someone who was used to controlling everything around him and wanted to know exactly what would happen next. "I don't plan on depending on your family." For the first time, Adrian looked up, holding my gaze for more than just a few seconds. "I didn't say you had to depend on us, but you think I'll end up that way." Adrian didn't answer right away. That in itself was answer enough. "I understand people like you. People who have been betrayed don't really listen to what others say. They just watch to see what they do next." Adrian's eyes lingered on the outdated phone in my hand as I checked the time. That model came out nearly 6 years ago. I looked down at the phone, noting the slight scratch on the corner of the screen. It still works. The Whitmores certainly weren't short on money to buy a new phone. I took a sip of my hot coffee and replied softly, "But I don't need one." A brief silence fell between us. For the first time, I saw something different in Adrian's eyes. It wasn't annoyance, it was suspicion. He was trying to figure out if this was the real me, or if I was just putting on an act. The days that followed passed in the strangest dynamic you could possibly call a marriage. Adrian was almost always around the villa, yet he kept just enough distance to make me feel like a guest. He didn't control me. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't check my phone. He didn't set any rules. But he watched everything. Like when I wore my old coat instead of the brand new clothes in the closet, or when I turned down the black card Eleanor brought to my room, or when I drove my beat-up Toyota to run errands instead of using the luxury cars parked in the garage. The Whitmore garage looked more like a supercar showroom than a family driveway. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom, a Bentley Flying Spur, a Mercedes Maybach, and a silver-gray Aston Martin parked right against the far wall. I glanced past them all and walked over to my old navy blue Toyota Camry. The garage attendant hesitated, completely caught off guard. "Miss Nora, the driver can take you." "It's fine. I prefer driving myself." I started the engine. The old Toyota rumbled with that slightly rough signature engine of a car with nearly 200,000 miles on it. As I pulled out of the gates, I caught a glimpse of Adrian standing on the second-floor balcony. He was looking down, watching. That evening, while I was working in the second-floor library, Adrian walked in. White dress shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled up. He stared at my laptop screen for a few seconds. "Are you working?" "A remote audit for a logistics company in Milwaukee. At nearly 11 o'clock at night?" "I prefer working at night." Adrian set his espresso cup down on the table. "You don't need the money. Everyone needs money. I can transfer funds to your account every month." "I know." "Then why are you still doing this?" I looked up at him, because I don't want to have to ask for anything. Adrian's gaze shifted ever so slightly at that. It was hard to tell if it was surprise or something closer to respect. But then, it vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. "You don't have to ask. That's not how things work." Adrian fell silent. I knew I was right. Sometimes, money isn't used to buy people. It's used to make them feel indebted. And when someone feels indebted to you for long enough, they start to believe they no longer have the right to leave. I had seen that my entire life with the Hayes family. I was never going to live like that again. 2 days later, Adrian placed a small black box on the kitchen counter in front of me. I thought you might need this. Inside was the latest iPhone. I stared at it for a few seconds before sliding the lid back on. Thank you, but my phone is working just fine. Nora, I'm serious. Adrian leaned his hands against the marble countertop, his gaze locked onto my face as if he were trying to search for something. You don't need to prove anything. No, I replied softly. I just don't want to feel like everything around me has a price. This time, Adrian didn't say another word. But that night, when I went down to the kitchen for a glass of water around 1 a.m, the box was gone from the counter. Not everyone at the Whitmore estate made me feel as tense as Adrian did. Eleanor started talking to me more after a few days. The head chef, Marcus, was diabetic, but kept it a secret so he could keep working to pay for his wife's medical bills. I found out when I caught him secretly taking insulin shots in the pantry. From the next day on, I quietly adjusted the breakfast menu. Less sugar, more light, healthy options. Marcus noticed immediately, but didn't say a word. He just looked at me for a long moment, then spoke softly. Thank you, Nora. I started learning everyone's names in the house. The laundry girl was taking night classes for law school at Columbia. The gardener loved old school jazz. The chauffeur's back always aches whenever the weather turns cold. Little things like that made the mansion feel a bit less like a museum. One night, Adrian didn't get home until almost 2 a.m. after an investment board meeting in Manhattan. I was sitting in the living room when I heard the door open. He paused for a few seconds when he saw the lights were still on. Why are you still awake? I thought you might need some aspirin. I pointed to the glass of water and the aspirin waiting on the table. Your driver mentioned you had a meeting with an investment fund in Boston today. Adrian stared at the medicine for a few seconds. You don't have to stay up waiting for me. I wasn't waiting up. I was a terrible liar. The corner of Adrian's mouth twitched as if he were about to smile, but he caught himself. That was the first time I realized Adrian wasn't as cold as I had thought. He was just too used to carrying everything on his own. A few days later, I was passing by Adrian's study when I heard another man's voice inside. What if she really doesn't need the money? I froze instinctively. That had to be Mason Carter, the only friend I'd ever seen Adrian meet with since I arrived. Silence fell over the room for a few seconds. Then Adrian replied, his voice barely a whisper. No one enters someone else's life without wanting something. Mason let out a sigh. I think your problem is that you always prepare for people to leave before they even get a chance to stay. There was no reply after that. Standing out in the hallway, I suddenly realized that the saddest thing about Adrian Whitmore wasn't his lack of trust. It was that he had lived for so long with the feeling that sooner or later he would be abandoned. That night, for the first time, Eleanor told me about Adrian's mother. She left when Master Adrian was only 9 years old. I remained silent. Mrs. Whitmore moved to Paris with a French real estate tycoon. Back then, the press called it the most beautiful love story in high society. Eleanor paused for a moment, looking down at the teacup in her hands. Master Adrian sat by the living room window for 3 whole days, waiting for her to come back. I felt a quiet ache tighten in my chest. Outside the window, snow continued to drift down onto the dark, silent gardens of the Whitmore estate. And for the first time since stepping into this cold mansion, I began to understand why a man who had everything in the world lived as if nothing could ever stay. Not everyone at the Whitmore estate made me feel like I was walking on thin ice the way Adrian did. After about a week, things began to change, ever so slowly. So slowly, in fact, that I would only notice it in quiet moments. Like standing in the kitchen near midnight, suddenly catching the sound of someone laughing softly down the hall. The Whitmore estate used to feel more like a perfectly run five-star hotel than a place where people actually lived. Everything was on time. Everything was pristine. Everything was precise. But it was completely devoid of human warmth. No one spoke more than they absolutely had to. No one lingered after finishing their work. Even the footsteps in the house were so quiet, it felt as though everyone was trying not to disturb some invisible presence. I started to remember each of their names. Emily, the girl in charge of the laundry, who was studying law at night at Columbia. Walter, the gardener who loved listening to Frank Sinatra while pruning the roses. Martha from the downstairs kitchen, who always hid a few chocolate cookies in her apron pocket to bring home to her grandchild. Little things like that made the mansion feel a bit less cold. One Wednesday morning, I went down to the kitchen just before 7 and found Marcus sitting alone in the pantry. He startled so badly he nearly dropped the insulin pen in his hand. "I'm sorry, Miss Nora. I was just..." Flustered, he quickly tucked the syringe into his pocket. I looked at the pale face of the man, who was nearly 60 years old, standing in the cold pantry smelling of vegetables and smoked meat. He had diabetes. The strange thing was, nobody else in the mansion knew about it. Marcus worked 13 hours a day because his wife was undergoing chemotherapy in Connecticut. If Whitmore Holdings ever found out his health was unstable, he would likely be replaced by a younger chef. Starting the very next morning, I began modifying the breakfast menu. Less sugar, more protein, whole wheat bread instead of croissants that were far too sweet. Marcus noticed almost immediately. He stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the fresh plate of eggs I had just prepared, before turning to look at me for a long moment. "Did you do this for me?" I kept slicing strawberries into a bowl of yogurt. I just think someone who cooks for the entire house every day deserves to have a decent meal too. Marcus didn't say another word. But that evening, for the first time since I arrived at the Whitmore estate, the warm scent of cinnamon apple pie drifted across the entire first floor. The smell of melted butter and sweet cinnamon, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the spacious kitchen, made this place feel like a real home for the very first time. Walter started playing soft jazz while tending to the plants in the backyard. Emily laughed out loud as Martha told a story about her grandson dropping birthday cake into the neighbor's pool. Soft laughter began to echo through the mansion, very softly, but it was enough to break the heavy silence that had hung over this place for far too long. The strange thing was, Adrian didn't say anything about those changes. He simply observed. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen island sipping tea when Adrian walked in just after 7 in the evening. I looked up almost immediately. "You're home early." Adrian realized that I had noticed too. "Is something wrong?" I glanced at the clock on the wall, then looked back at him. "I thought you only showed up here after midnight." The corner of Adrian's mouth twitched slightly. The board canceled their meeting. I didn't quite believe him, but he didn't press any further. Marcus stepped out of the main kitchen right then, carrying a warm apple pie. The scent of cinnamon and caramel instantly filled the room. Adrian stared at the pie for a few seconds, as if trying to remember the last time this mansion had smelled like fresh baking. Marcus cleared his throat softly. "Miss Nora said the weekends should feel a little more like home." Adrian turned to look at me. His gaze was completely still, but I could feel something shifting beneath his usual controlled exterior. That evening, for the first time, Adrian sat in the kitchen for nearly 30 minutes, just sipping espresso and listening to Walter and Marcus argue over whether New York or Chicago pizza was better. No one mentioned work. No one mentioned investments. No one mentioned contracts. The moment was so small it felt almost ordinary. But that was exactly why it mattered. A week later, Emily knocked on my door around 11 at night. The 22-year-old was clutching a thick stack of books to her chest, looking like she was on the verge of tears. "Do you know anything about business law?" I chuckled. I was a compliance auditor for nearly 6 years. Emily let out a massive sigh of relief. I spent nearly 2 hours with her in the second-floor library, explaining contract liability and partnership clauses ahead of her midterm at Columbia. When Emily finally grasped it, she slumped back onto the sofa and laughed out loud with pure relief. Her laughter echoed through the quiet library. That was when I noticed Adrian standing in the doorway, watching us. He was wearing a thin black sweater, holding an espresso, quietly watching us. Emily practically scrambled to her feet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Adrian, I was just..." "It's fine." Adrian's voice was completely calm. "Carry on." But instead of leaving, he stood there for a few more seconds, observing, not with his usual cold, analytical judgment, but like someone trying to understand why his home suddenly sounded different. "Since you got here, this place has started to feel more lived in." Adrian said it softly after Emily had left. I closed my laptop. "Is that a compliment?" Adrian looked around the library for a few seconds. "No one used to stay in this room past 8 p.m. Why? Because no one thought they were allowed to." His answer made me fall silent for a few seconds. Because it was just too real. Places that are too perfect often make people afraid to leave their mark. Over the next few weeks, Adrian started coming home earlier. It wasn't every day, but it was for everyone in the mansion to notice. Walter even gave me a knowing look when he saw the black Bentley pull into the garage at just 6:30 in the evening. Marcus started cooking dinner more often because Master Adrian was finally willing to eat on time. Even Eleanor had noticeably softened. One Saturday night, I fell asleep on the sofa in the library. My laptop was still open on my lap with an unfinished Excel sheet. I remember I was reviewing a compliance report for a shipping company in Seattle while a light snow fell outside. When I woke up, the room was dim, lit only by a soft, warm lamp. My laptop had been closed. A gray wool blanket was draped over me. I sat up slowly. Adrian was sitting near the window, reading documents under the glow of a desk lamp. His white dress shirt was slightly wrinkled at the cuffs. His glasses rested low on the bridge of his nose. It was so quiet I could hear the soft patter of snow against the window pane. "What time's it?" "Almost 1 in the morning. You could have woken me up." Adrian turned a page of his document. "You were sleeping soundly." His voice was barely a whisper. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "What about you?" Adrian was quiet for a few seconds before closing the file. "I prefer this time." "When?" He looked around the vast library, bathed in the soft, warm light. "When the house actually has someone in it." My heart clenched slightly, not because his words were overly romantic, but because they were real. I stared at the man in front of me for a long moment, realizing that the biggest change in Adrian wasn't that he had become gentler. It was that he no longer lived as if he were constantly bracing himself to be abandoned. The next evening, I was sitting in my room reading some documents when the landline downstairs rang. "Mason Carter is on the phone for you." I was a bit surprised. Mason was the only friend of Adrian's I had ever met. I went down to the living room to take the call. Mason's voice on the other end was quite low. "Nora, is Adrian home yet?" "Not yet. Is something wrong?" Mason was silent for a few seconds. Today is the anniversary of the day his mother left. I started to realize something was wrong around 8 in the evening. The Whitmore estate was unusually quiet that day. It wasn't the cold, familiar silence the mansion was known for, but a heavy, quiet stillness that made even the longtime staff lower their voices. In the kitchen, Marcus dropped a metal spoon and froze instantly, as if he had just made a terrible mistake. Out on the patio, Walter turned off the jazz music much earlier than usual. Even the mansion's lights were dimmed lower than usual. I was sitting in the library reviewing a compliance report when my phone buzzed. Mason Carter. I was a bit surprised to see his name on the screen. "Hello? Nora." Mason's voice immediately dropped. "Is Adrian home yet?" "No." "Is something wrong?" Mason was silent for a few seconds. "Today is the day his mother left." I didn't know what to say. I thought he'd be doing better this year. Mason sounded exhausted. But Adrian is never really okay on this day. I stood up from my chair. Where is he? Probably that old whiskey bar near the Brooklyn Bridge. The place he goes every year. 40 minutes later, I found Adrian in a small bar at the end of a street near Brooklyn Heights. Outside, a light snow was falling. The faded yellow neon sign of the Whiskey Bar Bear flickered in the cold wind. Through the fogged-up glass, I could see Adrian sitting alone in the far corner. A few unmelted snowflakes still clung to the shoulders of his black coat. In front of him was a nearly empty glass of whiskey. The bar wasn't crowded. Faint jazz music drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of oak, stale tobacco, and aged whiskey. The bartender looked up as I walked in, gesturing subtly toward Adrian, as if he was all too familiar with someone coming to find him on this day. I had never seen Adrian like this before. He wasn't drunk in an out-of-control way, he just looked completely exhausted. So tired that the tightly wound shield of control he always carried seemed to have cracked. Just a little. I pulled out a chair and sat down next to him. Adrian looked up slowly. "Nora?" His voice was raspier than usual. "I thought you didn't drink. I thought so too." He let out a faint, self-deprecating laugh, looking back down at the glass in his hand. Outside, snow continued to blanket the streets of Brooklyn as midnight drew near. I didn't ask any questions. It was a lesson I had learned after years of living around people who constantly bottled up their emotions. Sometimes, people don't need to be fixed. They just need someone who won't walk away the moment they see them at their worst. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. The ice melted slowly in the whiskey glass. A saxophone played softly from the far corner of the bar. The scent of cinnamon and burning wood drifted gently from the bar. "Did Luis call you?" Adrian asked, without looking at me. "Yeah." He gave a slow nod. "I'm going to fire him. I thought you'd hug him first." The corner of Adrian's mouth twitched, but the faint smile vanished in an instant. Even at his absolute lowest, he still tried to look like he had it all together. Like a man who had lived too long with the belief that if he collapsed in front of anyone, they would only use his weakness to hurt him again. I reached out and took the whiskey glass from his hand. "That's enough." Adrian frowned slightly. "Do you always like giving orders? Only when someone is acting stupid." This time, he actually let out a soft laugh. It was incredibly brief, but it was the first time I'd heard Adrian laugh since our marriage began. I drove him home around 11 at night. Snow covered the driveway of the Whitmore estate. Adrian got out of the car a little slower than usual, but he still tried to maintain his composure. He hated letting anyone see him vulnerable. I had realized that a long time ago. Adrian slipped off his coat and walked straight into the kitchen. The soft, warm light cast a glow over the cold marble countertop. He slid down to the floor, leaning his back against the kitchen cabinets as if his body had finally run out of the strength to keep pretending he was fine. I stood a few steps away. The man who held absolute control in multi-million-dollar boardrooms now looked like nothing more than a lost boy, trying to convince himself that it didn't hurt anymore. "I was 9 years old," Adrian said suddenly. I didn't interrupt. "My mother told me she was going on a business trip for 3 days. His voice grew quieter. "She even kissed my hair before she left." The kitchen was so quiet that I could hear the wall clock ticking away the seconds. I sat by the living room window for those entire 3 days. Adrian looked down at the cold, polished marble floor beneath him. On the 4th day, my father received the divorce papers. I felt my chest tighten slightly. She moved to Paris with a French real estate billionaire. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. The press called it the most beautiful high society romance of the year. The warm light washed over his face, stripping away any trace of the powerful young CEO of Whitmore Holdings. He just looked like a man who was completely exhausted from being strong for so long. I always thought, maybe I just wasn't good enough for her to stay. Adrian spoke those words so softly it felt like he hadn't even meant for me to hear them. It was just that after keeping it bottled up for so many years, the truth had finally slipped out on its own. And that was when I realized the saddest truth of all. So many adults are really just trying to survive alongside the most wounded version of their childhood selves. They grow up. They make money. They learn to run massive corporations. They become so strong that everyone assumes they don't need a single soul. But deep down, they are still that child standing by the window, waiting for someone who is never coming back. Adrian covered his eyes with his hand for a few seconds, then let out a heavy sigh. I've always believed that if you let yourself need someone, they'll eventually leave anyway. I didn't know what to say, because the most painful part was, I knew exactly how that felt. I grew up in a home where love always came with conditions. If you were good enough, if you were useful enough, if you were easy enough to sacrifice, then maybe, just maybe, they would keep you around. I sat down on the chair opposite Adrian. I didn't hug him. I didn't offer any of those perfect, cliché healing words you hear in the movies. I simply set my glass down near him and stayed. Just like that, I didn't try to fix him. I didn't force him to be strong again. And I didn't turn his pain into some cheap inspirational lesson. Close to midnight, Adrian leaned his head back against the kitchen cabinet and stared up at the ceiling. Outside the glass window, snow continued to blanket the garden behind the villa in pure white. Have you ever stayed with someone just because you wanted to? His voice was barely a whisper. I looked at Adrian for a few quiet seconds, and then I answered honestly, yes. And they still left? Yeah. Adrian gave a slow, gentle nod, as someone had finally told him a truth he actually understood. No one is immune to pain. We just learn how to carry it with us. He closed his eyes then. I don't want to become my father. I looked at the man sitting under the warm light for a very long time. You're nothing like him. How do you know? Because you're still afraid of hurting people. The entire kitchen fell silent. Outside, the snow continued to blanket the Whitmore estate. And I sat there for almost another hour, watching the man who always kept everything under control finally allow himself to just be tired for once. And strangely enough, that was the first moment Adrian Whitmore actually felt close to me. Everything began to change on a Friday evening in mid-February. Manhattan was covered in a light dusting of snow that evening, after a cold drizzle that had dragged on since morning. The warm yellow streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement made the city look like a slow-motion film under a silver-gray winter sky. I had almost refused to go with Adrian to the party that night. After that night in the kitchen, things between us began to shift in a way that was hard to put into words. Adrian was still quiet, still instinctively keeping his distance, but his usual coldness had lost its sharp edge. He started asking if I'd eaten dinner yet when he got home late. He started remembering the kind of tea I liked. Once, I fell asleep on the sofa while working, and when I woke up the next morning, my laptop was fully charged with a fresh cup of tea sitting on the side table. Little things like that are far more dangerous than any flirtation. They soften your heart before you even realize it. Maybe that's why, in the end, I agreed to accompany him to a Manhattan old money party that evening. The black dress Eleanor had prepared for me was simpler than I expected. Not too flashy, not too revealing, just enough to make me feel like I belonged there, if only a little. Adrian was waiting in the foyer when I walked down the stairs. He wore a simple black tuxedo, free of the excessive accessories of the wealthy men I used to see at Vivian's galas. As I reached the bottom step, Adrian looked up at me. Then he fell silent for a few seconds. Is there something wrong with my dress? He adjusted his cuffs slightly, as if trying to hide his fleeting reaction. No. Adrian looked at me longer than usual. You look perfect. That was the closest thing to a compliment I had ever received from him. The black Bentley brought us to the Grand Astoria Hotel in Midtown just before 8 in the evening. The entire top-floor ballroom had been rented out for a private charity gala hosted by Manhattan's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast their light over expensive champagne flutes and sequined couture gowns. Soft live jazz echoed from the far end of the hall. The scent of expensive perfume, light laughter, and the clinking of glasses created an atmosphere that only exists in a world where paying rent is never a worry. I quickly realized that Adrian was nothing like most of the men here. He didn't try to draw attention to himself. He didn't talk too much. He didn't touch anyone more than necessary. Yet, people instinctively parted to make way whenever he walked by. That kind of respect didn't come from his wealth. It came from the fact that Adrian was a man who always kept his word. A silver-haired man in a navy suit stepped forward to shake his hand. "Whitmore, I heard the Dubai Investment Fund just closed another deal with the Aspen Ridge hotel chain." Adrian gave a slight nod. "Congratulations on the Chicago deal." Conversations around him were always this brief. No bragging, no fake friendliness, but enough for everyone to know who held the real power in the room. In that moment, for the first time since entering this strange marriage, I felt like I wasn't completely out of place anymore. Adrian handed me a glass of champagne, then leaned down slightly. "You okay?" "Yeah." He held my gaze for a few seconds, as if making sure I meant it, before turning back to continue his conversation with some investors nearby. I stood by the glass window, looking down at a snow-covered Manhattan below. The golden lights stretched down the avenue like a river of light in the winter night. The moment was so beautiful, I almost forgot how coldly this new life of mine had begun, all starting with a sterile contract. "Claire Whitmore?" A man's voice behind me made me turn around. The man in front of me was in his early 40s, wearing a platinum band, standing next to his wife, and 2 kids who were eating cake at the far end of the ballroom. He looked at me for a few seconds, then let out a surprised laugh. "Finally, I get to meet you in person." I hesitated for a second. "I'm sorry?" "Adrian has never let anyone meet you before." Before I could process what he meant, Adrian quickly stepped in. "Hudson," his voice dropped low. The man looked back and forth between Adrian and me, then let out a laugh. "Hold on." He frowned. "Don't tell me she doesn't know?" I turned to look at Adrian. His entire body visibly stiffened. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw Adrian Whitmore look genuinely panicked. A cold chill ran down my spine. "Know what?" No one answered right away. The woman next to Hudson gently tugged at her husband's arm, trying to stop him, but it was already too late. "I thought you knew Adrian was the one behind the marriage contract from the start." Suddenly, all the surrounding sounds drifted far away. The jazz music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. Everything vanished, as if submerged underwater. I looked at Adrian. What did he mean? Adrian takes a slow, deep breath. "Nora, don't say my name like that right now." My voice trembles, even though I'm trying so hard to stay calm. "The man I married. Isn't he your brother?" "No, just one word. But it's enough to make everything in my head come crashing down. From the very beginning, the name on our marriage certificate was yours." Adrian doesn't deny it. I step back instinctively, not because of some plot twist out of a movie, but because of a different feeling. One that hurts so much more. Humiliation. I remember everything. All those times he watched me, how he tested my reactions to money. The black card, the phone, the evaluating look in his eyes every time I refused to accept something from him. I was never actually seen as a real person. I was a test, a project designed to evaluate my greed, a woman placed in an emotional laboratory she didn't even know she was in. "Nora." Adrian takes a step closer. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" I let out a soft laugh, but my throat burns. "That you needed to make sure I wasn't like your mother before you could treat me kindly." "It's not like that." "Then what is it?" Adrian looks at me, but he can't answer right away, because for the first time, he doesn't have a logical explanation for his actions. I feel my eyes burning, but I try to keep my voice steady. "I thought you were the first person in that house who actually saw me as a real human being." "Nora, but it turns out you were just watching to see if I would pass your test. The people around us are starting to realize something is wrong." Hudson quietly leads his wife away, leaving the balcony overlooking a snow-covered Manhattan almost entirely to the two of us. Snow starts falling gently outside. Adrian takes another step closer, but this time, I step back. I know I was wrong. The worst part is, he didn't even think he was wrong when he first started this. Those words hit Adrian right where it hurt. I could see it on his face. For the first time, Adrian Whitmore's perfect mask of control cracked. I thought that if someone was only after money, they'd eventually show their true colors. Adrian spoke very slowly. And if I didn't pass, he was silent. I let out a soft laugh. I'd just be another piece of proof that all women are the same, right? Nora, listen to me. No, I looked straight at him. You're going to listen to me. The cold Manhattan wind swept across the snow-covered balcony. I took a deep breath, but my voice still caught. People who have been abandoned always think everyone else is going to leave, too. I get that. Adrian stood frozen. But do you know what the scariest part is? I looked straight into his eyes. It's when someone who did nothing wrong has to pay for another person's mistakes. Adrian's entire face tightened, as if he'd just been struck. And for the first time since I met him, I think Adrian finally realized what he had done. He wasn't protecting himself. He was punishing someone else for his own past pain. I continued, very slowly. I never asked to be in your life, Adrian, and I didn't make your mother leave. The snow fell cold against my shoulders. But you treat me like I'm the one responsible for it. No, yes, I looked at him. You don't love me. My voice caught, barely a whisper. You're just testing me. For the first time since I stepped into the Whitmore estate, Adrian Whitmore didn't look like the man who was always in control. He just stood there in the middle of snowy Manhattan, looking like a man who had finally realized he'd just hurt the only person who made his cold house actually feel like a home. I turned and walked away before Adrian could say another word. The click of my heels echoed across the marble floor of the ballroom. The sound of jazz, the laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses. Everything kept going as if nothing had happened, and as I walked out of the Grand Astoria into the heavy Manhattan snow, I realized for the first time that the most painful part wasn't that this marriage started with a contract. It was the moment I actually started to believe it could be real. I didn't speak to Adrian for almost 4 days after that party in Manhattan. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, tearful rage you see in the movies. No throwing things, no sobbing. I just became polite to the point of being completely detached. I only ate breakfast after he had left the estate. I worked in the library instead of the living room. I answered his questions with the bare minimum. Even when we crossed paths in the kitchen at midnight, I would only give him a cold nod and walk past, as if Adrian Whitmore were nothing more than a stranger I happened to share a house with. And for the first time in his life, Adrian found himself on the receiving end of that emotional distance. The strange thing was, he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't chase me around the mansion with long speeches about his traumatic childhood. He didn't try to play the victim to make me soften up. He just stayed quiet. And he began to make changes in the smallest of ways. That was exactly what made it so hard for me to keep my guard up. On Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. When I walked into the kitchen, I froze for a few seconds. The entire old staff was back. Marcus was arguing with the delivery driver about receiving the wrong cut of Atlantic salmon. Walter was playing low jazz in the backyard while pruning the snow-covered hedges. And the moment Martha saw me, she quickly hid a tray of freshly baked cookies, like a child caught doing something mischievous. For the first time since I arrived, the mansion actually sounded alive. The clinking of glasses, soft laughter, people calling out to each other in the kitchen. Adrian was standing by the marble island, reading emails on his iPad, white shirt, his tie was loosened. His expression was as calm as ever, but I knew this was his doing. Adrian looked up when he saw me. I didn't think this house should make someone live like a guest. That was all. No pleading for forgiveness, no trying to score points. But I knew exactly what he meant. He had seen my loneliness from the very beginning. He was just too busy defending himself back to admit it. I quietly sat down on a bar stool by the kitchen island. Marcus placed a plate of warm pancakes in front of me, topped with fresh strawberries and maple syrup. "Eat up before it gets cold, Miss Nora." I looked around the kitchen, filled with warm golden light and the hum of voices, and suddenly found myself remembering the Whitmore estate when I first arrived. Cold. Perfect. As quiet as an empty 5-star hotel. Now this place actually sounded like a home. The most dangerous thing was that a part of me was still softening because of it. That afternoon, I returned to my room after calling my father, only to realize something was different. The room had changed. The sterile, cold tones of a hotel suite were completely gone. The cream-colored reading chair I'd spent ages staring at in that Greenwich furniture store now sat right by the window. A low oak bookshelf rested against the wall, lined with a few novels I'd once mentioned liking. Even the warm golden reading lamp I'd once said felt more like home was sitting right next to the sofa. I stood in the center of the room for a few seconds. It was all in the little things. But they were enough for me to realize that Adrian had paid attention to everything. That evening, I found him in the library. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated his sharp profile as he stared down at his laptop screen. "Why did you do that?" Adrian looked up from his screen. "Because you once said you hated that room." That was the first time he'd ever addressed me with such soft intimacy. It sounded so natural. As if Adrian himself didn't even realize he had done it. I froze for a second. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "You said it felt more like a hotel suite than a home." I stared at him for a long moment, completely lost for words. The hardest part isn't forgiving someone. It's when they genuinely start to change, and you realize you still want to believe in them. 2 days later, Adrian came home just before 6 o'clock in the evening. I was sitting in the parlor, reading through some documents, when I heard the front door open downstairs. Whitmore Estate felt completely different now. There was the warm aroma of fresh baking, even though it was only Wednesday. Soft jazz played quietly in the kitchen. A couple of forgotten coffee mugs sat on the table, left behind by someone who had fallen asleep while working. There was a human touch to the place. Adrian stepped into the parlor and paused for a brief moment when he saw I was still there. Before, he would have walked straight up to his study. But this time, he stood perfectly still, like someone who wasn't sure if he was still allowed to take another step closer. He unclasped his watch and placed it on the table. "Mason mentioned you haven't eaten dinner yet." I frowned slightly. Is Mason keeping track of my eating schedule now? The corner of Adrian's mouth twitched slightly. "No. He just mentioned you've been working since this morning." I looked back down at my laptop screen. "I'm not hungry yet. Marcus made seafood pasta." Adrian lingered for a few seconds before adding softly, "He'll be disappointed if you don't eat." I almost laughed. Partly because of the way he desperately tried to find a logical excuse just to show he cared. Partly because I realized he still hadn't figured out how to step into someone else's emotional world without feeling so out of place. We went down to the kitchen together for the first time in days. Marcus's eyes practically lit up when he saw the two of us walk in together. The warm golden light gleamed off the marble countertops and the copper pots hanging above the stove. The rich aroma of cream sauce and warm garlic drifted through the air. Walter even whistled, "Fly Me to the Moon," as he passed by the back door. That moment was so simple it felt almost ordinary. And maybe that was why it made my heart ache even more, because I was starting to see the life we could have had, if everything hadn't started with a lie. That night, I fell asleep on the sofa close to midnight. My laptop was still open on my lap, showing an unfinished compliance report. When I woke up, the room was bathed in a very soft, dim light. A gray wool blanket had been draped over me. Adrian was standing by the window, watching the snow fall in the backyard. He turned around when he heard me move. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." I pulled the blanket up to my shoulders. "What time is it?" Almost 1 in the morning. The Whitmore estate was wrapped in the soft silence of the late night. It wasn't that cold, suffocating silence from before, but rather the peaceful warmth of a home that finally felt truly lived in. Adrian took a step closer, then paused, as if he still wasn't sure what a safe distance was between us right now. "Nora." His voice grew low. "I know I have no right to ask you to trust me right away." I looked at the man standing in front of me. For the first time since I'd known him, Adrian wasn't trying to control everything. He just stood there with the exhaustion of someone who finally understood how painful it was to be shut out. I didn't answer right away, because the most dangerous thing wasn't that Adrian had hurt me. It was that, after everything, a part of me still wanted to believe him one more time. Victoria Hayes showed up at the Whitmore estate on a freezing, snowy Thursday afternoon. I had barely stepped off the stairs when I heard her voice echoing from the main living room. "She is your wife now. Helping her family out a bit is only natural." Victoria's voice was as soft as always. The kind of softness that kept you from realizing you were being manipulated until it was far too late. I froze at the top of the stairs for a few seconds. Victoria was wearing a cream-colored fur coat, a white diamond bracelet on her wrist, catching the light from the crystal chandelier in the foyer. She sat on the sofa as if she were the rightful owner of the estate. Adrian stood opposite her by the fireplace. Wearing a dark gray shirt, his hands were shoved in his pockets. His face was calm to the point of being icy. I believe Whitmore Holdings finalized the last support payment last month. Adrian's voice was incredibly low. Victoria offered a faint smile. "That's true, but the situation at Hayes Freight is still far from stable." I nearly laughed out loud. Hayes Freight was never unstable in the way she claimed. Once Adrian took over the debt, the company was completely saved. Victoria just never knew when to stop. After all, family is supposed to help each other. She said it so effortlessly, as if forcing me to sign that prenup had never even happened. Adrian stared at her for a few seconds. "Family," he repeated the word slowly. "Is that why you forced Nora into this marriage?" The smile on Victoria's face stiffened slightly. "You don't understand our family affairs. No." Adrian walked over to the glass table and set a folder down in front of her. "I understand them all too well." The atmosphere in the living room shifted instantly. I had never seen Adrian like this before. He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. But the calmer he was, the more suffocating it felt. Victoria frowned slightly as she looked down at the folder. "What is this?" "The internal audit reports for Hayes Freight over the last 3 years. Adrian's voice remained flat and even. "Including personal transfers into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under your name." The entire room fell dead silent. I looked at Victoria. For the first time since I had known her, I saw a genuine panic flicker in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" Victoria let out a forced laugh, but her voice faltered. Adrian pulled a few papers out of the folder. $3,400,000 transferred through Shell investment funds over 2 years. He placed each page down on the glass table. Funds for real estate in Miami, European vacations, failed personal investments. Each figure rang out coldly in the spacious room bathed in warm light. I instinctively turned to look at my father. He was standing near the window, though I hadn't noticed when he got there. His shoulders were slumped. He avoided looking at anyone. And in that moment I understood. He knew. My father had known about this for a long time. Daniel Hayes finally spoke up. "Victoria, we should talk in private." Victoria whipped around to face him. "Shut up." Her voice was razor-sharp for the first time since she stepped into the mansion. "If you weren't so weak, we wouldn't be in this position." I felt something tighten in my chest. It had always been this way. Victoria hurt people, and my father stayed silent, letting it happen. Adrian looked at my father for a few seconds before turning to Victoria. "You didn't just embezzle company funds." He spoke very slowly. "You also used that debt to force Nora into this marriage." Victoria let out a cold laugh. "She gets to live in a billionaire's mansion, and you're talking as if I ruined her life?" That was the final straw. I walked all the way down the stairs and looked straight at the woman who had made me grow up, feeling like I was always the easiest one to sacrifice. I was never the one who deserved to be sacrificed. My voice trembled slightly, but for the first time in my life, I didn't avoid her gaze. Victoria froze for a few seconds, as if she couldn't believe I dared to say that. My entire life, you've made me feel like I had to be useful just to be kept around. I looked at her. If the company had a problem, I was traded away. If the family needed something, I was the one who had to give it up first. Each word made my throat burn more. But I didn't stop. I was never your daughter. I was just the price you were willing to pay to keep your life. Victoria stood up abruptly. Don't talk to me like that. Why not? Hot tears began to well up in the corners of my eyes. I've been silent my whole life. The air in the room grew heavy. Outside the glass window, snow continued to fall over the Whitmore estate gardens. My father suddenly sank into the sofa as if all the strength had just drained from his body. I looked at him. And for the first time since entering this house, I saw my father break down in tears. It wasn't a loud cry, just an old man who finally couldn't pretend to be okay anymore. I'm sorry. His voice cracked. I failed you. A long time ago, I felt my heart ache, not because I was angry, but because a part of me had waited for those words for so long that I'd almost forgotten I ever needed them. Daniel Hayes hung his head. I knew she took the money. His breathing was labored. I knew. Forcing you to marry Adrian was wrong, too. Then why didn't you stop it? This time, my father truly broke down in tears, because I was a coward. The entire room fell completely silent. Even Victoria couldn't say another word. Adrian stepped up to stand beside me. He didn't touch me. He didn't try to hug me or pull me in like they do in the movies. He just stood there, on the same side as me, and strangely enough, it made me feel less lonely than any words of comfort ever could. 10 minutes later, 2 legal representatives from Whitmore Holdings stepped into the living room. Victoria went pale the moment she saw them. What is this? An official financial investigation. Adrian replied, his voice completely calm. Starting today, you can't do this. I can. Adrian looked straight at her, and I will. Victoria left the Whitmore estate nearly half an hour later, completely losing her composure. She still tried to maintain her elegant facade, but her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold her phone. For the first time in my life, I saw that woman truly terrified, not because she was losing money, but because she was losing control. After the door closed, the room fell into a heavy silence. My father was still sitting on the sofa, his head hung low. Looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon, I didn't know what to say anymore. Years of deep hurt couldn't just vanish with a few simple apologies. But for the first time, at least the truth was finally called by its real name. Adrian turned to me very slowly. Are you okay? I nodded reflexively, only to suddenly realize I was about to cry, not because I was sad, but because I was just so tired of spending my whole life protecting myself. Completely alone, Adrian stepped closer, but maintained just enough distance to keep me from feeling pressured. Nora. His voice dropped. I don't want you to have to fight alone anymore. I stared at Adrian for a long moment. Then, for the first time since that night in Manhattan, I asked him what was truly on my mind. Why are you doing all of this now? Adrian was silent for a few seconds. Because before, I thought keeping my distance would keep me safe. He let out a soft, hollow laugh. But it turns out, distance doesn't protect anyone. That night, Adrian knocked on my door at almost 1 a.m. In his hand, he held a small silver key. There is a record room in the east basement. He held the key out to me. The passcode is my father's birthday. I stared at the key in his hand, not quite understanding. Inside are all of the Whitmore family's financial records. Trust funds, assets, investment contracts. Adrian looked straight into my eyes for the first time without looking away. Only my father and I had access to it before. I didn't take it right away. Adrian. I'm not giving you this because of the money. His voice was calm, but his hands tightened slightly. I'm giving it to you because I don't see you as an outsider anymore. I felt a lump rise in my throat, because I finally understood that what I had needed all along was never the mansion, the money, or this luxurious life. It was the feeling of being chosen, of being trusted, of being seen as someone of value, without having to sacrifice anything else. And sometimes, trust is far more precious than love. Things between Adrian and me didn't change like they do in the movies. There was no sudden moment where we both realized we were in love and rushed into each other's arms in the snow. No long, breathless confessions, no grand gestures to prove our love to the world. It changed very slowly. So slowly that most of the time I only realized it after everything had already changed. Like a cold room slowly warming up, where the person inside only notices when they no longer need to pull the blankets tight. One Saturday afternoon, Adrian asked if I wanted to go out with him. Where to? To pick up a few things. I had to bite back a laugh. Adrian Whitmore said the words, "Pick up a few things," in a tone that made it sound like he was about to sign a $100 million deal. Those few things turned into nearly 3 hours at a furniture store out in Greenwich. I never would have pegged Adrian as the type of man who would stand between two nearly identical curtain swatches and debate with the designer for 15 minutes. This one is grayer. He pointed to the fabric swatch in his hand. No, I crossed my arms, looking at the two swatches in front of us. This one is just sadder. Adrian turned to look at me. Are you seriously judging curtain colors based on emotion? Of course. I raised an eyebrow. People live in a home, not an interior design catalog. The corner of Adrian's mouth tugged upward. Since when did you start talking like a 40-year-old housewife? Since you forced me to live in a mansion that feels like a divorce attorney's office. The designer standing next to us turned red, trying desperately to hold in a laugh. The strange thing was, Adrian wasn't annoyed at all. In fact, he was starting to enjoy watching me push back. I realized it the moment he stood leaning against the checkout counter, quietly watching me debate with the staff about how a cream sofa would make the second living room feel so much warmer than a cold gray. It wasn't because he actually cared about the sofa, but because, for the first time, someone was turning that house into a place to live, rather than just a place to exist. We ended up buying far more than we had planned. A new reading chair, 2 warm-toned table lamps, a low oak bookshelf, and a pile of decorative pillows that Adrian called pointless, overpriced lumps of fabric. You still bought them, though. I looked at the pile of shopping bags packed into the back of the car. Adrian shut the trunk of the Bentley. I married someone who can spend 20 minutes choosing the color of a pillow. He looked at me, completely serious. Clearly, he had already accepted defeat. For the first time since this marriage began, I let out a genuine, effortless laugh. The sound made Adrian freeze for a few seconds, as if he still wasn't used to the fact that he could actually make me laugh. On the way back, a light snow began to fall. Tiny snowflakes drifted against the windshield, melting instantly under the soft glow of the streetlights. Just before midnight, Adrian suddenly pulled into a 24-hour burger joint off the highway. I turned to look at him. Did a Whitmore just decide to eat fast food? Adrian unbuckled his seatbelt. Don't tell the board. 10 minutes later, we were sitting in the car in the middle of a nearly empty parking lot, holding 2 warm burgers in our hands. Adrian sat there in a simple black jacket, eating French fries at nearly 1 in the morning, looking like just an ordinary guy, instead of the 5-star hotel mogul the Manhattan Press wrote about every week. I watched him take a bite of his burger and frown. What? You eat the pickles first. Adrian looked down at the burger in his hands for a few seconds. So? I've never seen anyone do that before. He looked thoughtful, entirely serious, maybe because I'm a psychopath. I burst out laughing so hard I almost spilled my Coke all over myself. Sleet tapped gently against the car window. Outside, the distant lights of a gas station flickered, and the road was almost completely deserted in the dead of night. The moment was so simple, There was absolutely nothing special about it, and maybe that was why it felt so real. Mature love doesn't always look like the final scene of a movie. Sometimes it's just sitting in a car, eating burgers with someone who makes you feel like you're not alone anymore. Over the following weeks, Adrian started coming home earlier. No one said a word, but everyone at the Whitmore estate noticed. Marcus once caught my eye and gave me a knowing smile when he saw Adrian sipping espresso in the kitchen at 7 in the evening, instead of being stuck at the office like usual. Walter started playing jazz music a little louder in the backyard. Even Eleanor had noticeably softened. The Whitmore estate felt entirely different now. Soft music echoed from the kitchen. The scent of cinnamon apple pie drifted through the air on weekends. Half-empty coffee mugs were left on the living room table because someone had fallen asleep during a movie. The sound of laughter echoed down the hallways. For the first time since I stepped foot inside, the Whitmore mansion was starting to feel like a home. One night, I fell asleep on the sofa in the library. My laptop was still open on my lap, displaying an unfinished audit sheet. When I woke up, the room was bathed in a very soft, warm glow. My laptop had been closed. A gray woolen blanket was draped over me. Adrian was sitting near the window, reading documents under the desk lamp. His glasses rested low on the bridge of his nose. His shirt sleeves were slightly rumpled at the wrists. It was so quiet I could hear the snow falling outside the window. "What time is it?" "Almost 1 in the morning. You could have woken me up." Adrian turned another page of his document and replied softly, "You were sleeping so soundly." I sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "What about you?" Adrian fell silent for a few seconds before closing the folder. "I like this time better." "When?" He looked around the library, which was bathed in a soft, warm light. "When there's someone in the house." My heart squeezed slightly. Not because those words were overly romantic, but because they were real. I stared at the man in front of me for a long time, realizing that the biggest change in Adrian wasn't that he had become gentler, but that he no longer lived as if he were constantly bracing himself to be left behind. He started leaving his personal belongings outside his study. He started getting enough sleep. He started telling me about the little things in his day, things he used to keep entirely to himself. Once, Adrian came home looking exhausted after an investment board meeting in Manhattan. "That bad?" I handed him a cup of hot tea. Adrian sat down on the sofa, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had just spent 2 hours listening to 3 men in their 60s argue over the color of a new hotel logo. I tried to hold back a laugh. "That sounds terrible." "I'm beginning to think money can't buy maturity." I chuckled softly and sat down on the floor next to the sofa. We were so much closer than before. No more awkwardness. No more being constantly on guard. Adrian looked at me for a few seconds. "I used to think love made people weak. And now?" He leaned his head back, his gaze softening slowly. "Around you, I don't have to keep my guard up anymore." Those words lingered in my mind long after that night, because I finally understood what mature love really is. It's not about someone coming to save you. It's not about grand gestures. It's the feeling of your body finally letting go of its tension around someone. Like after so many years, you no longer have to brace yourself to get hurt. And maybe that is the rarest kind of peace in the world. Winter in Connecticut is always quiet in a way that makes you remember the things you thought you had left behind. That evening, the Whitmore estate was bathed in its usual soft, warm light. Outside the window, a light snow drifted down over the back garden, blanketing Walter's rose bushes in a thin, cottony layer of white. Marcus had turned off the oven not long ago, leaving the entire first floor smelling of warm cinnamon apple pie and hot butter. I was sitting on the parlor floor with Emily, helping her edit her essay, when my phone started buzzing incessantly. Emily looked at her screen and chuckled. "Twitter is going crazy because Adrian Whitmore just declined to attend the Forbes Gala tonight." I raised an eyebrow. "That's rare." Emily closed her laptop. "All of Manhattan is guessing he's secretly signing some billion-dollar deal." I almost laughed. If the press knew where Adrian Whitmore was right now, they'd be in absolute shock. Right then, the sound of the kitchen door opening echoed from the end of the hallway. Adrian walked in, holding 2 paper bags of hot food, with a few stray snowflakes still clinging to his coat. He looked at us for a few seconds. "Why are you two still awake?" Emily immediately stood up like a student caught by a teacher. "I'm going up to my room now." She practically bolted before Adrian could say another word. I watched her go and let out a soft chuckle. I guess I'm scarier than I thought. Adrian set the paper bags down on the coffee table. "No, they just like you more than me." I opened the bags of food. "Burgers again?" He took off his watch and placed it on the table. Marcus was furious that I ordered takeout after he spent 3 hours cooking. I laughed. "Then why did you still buy them?" Adrian sat down on the sofa across from me. "Because I wanted to eat burgers with you near midnight." The words were so simple that my heart skipped a beat for a few seconds. No more tests, no more complex defenses. Just a man starting to learn how to say what he truly wants. We ate dinner right on the living room rug, like 2 ordinary people. No grand dining room. No silver cutlery. No crystal chandeliers of the Manhattan elite. Just soft jazz playing from the speaker in the corner of the room, a warm golden light, and the scent of hot fries. Outside, the snow was falling a little heavier. Adrian leaned his head back against the sofa, holding a cup of Coke as if he had finally learned how to slow down. "Do you know what the strangest thing is?" I looked at him. "What?" I used to think I'd hate the feeling of having to come home every night. Adrian looked at the snow lit up through the glass. "Now, I want to come home earlier every day." I was silent for a few seconds. "Because this place finally feels like home." Adrian turned to look at me for a long time. "No." His voice dropped. "Because you are here." My heart skipped a soft, heavy beat. Sometimes, words don't need to be grand to completely soften your heart. Around nearly 1 in the morning, I was gathering up the pile of burger wrappers when Adrian suddenly stood up. He walked over to the bookshelf near the window, pausing for a few seconds as if trying to collect his thoughts. I watched him. "Adrian?" He turned around. Very slowly, no tuxedo, no flashing media lights, no multi-million-dollar diamond ring under the applause of high society. Just Adrian Whitmore, standing in the middle of a living room, bathed in soft, warm light, wearing a simple black sweater. "I'm not very good at this." His voice was soft and slightly raspy. I let out a soft laugh. "At what?" Saying the things I should have said a long time ago. The entire room fell silent. Only the gentle brush of the winter wind against the window pane and the faint ticking of the clock at the far end of the hallway. Adrian took a few steps closer. When we first started this marriage, I thought that if I kept my distance, I would never get hurt again. He gave a soft, self-deprecating smile. "But then you walked into that house, and turned it into a place someone would actually want to come home to." I felt my throat tighten. Adrian looked at me for a long moment before continuing. "I used to think love was just something that made you lose control." His gaze softened, very slowly. "But it turns out the scariest thing isn't loving someone, it's living your whole life without ever having the courage to be honest with them." I stood completely still, saying nothing, because I knew just how much this moment meant to Adrian. A man who has spent almost his entire life keeping his guard up doesn't easily shed his armor in front of anyone. He took a slow, deep breath. "I don't want you to ever feel like you have to sacrifice yourself just to stay with me." Hot tears began to well up in my eyes. Adrian took another step closer. He didn't get down on one knee like in the movies. He didn't pull out a ring right away. He just stood there, looking like a man who had finally stopped hiding behind the walls he'd built. "If you choose to stay this time, his voice grew softer. "I want it to be because you truly want to, not because of a contract, not because of obligation, and not because you feel like you owe me anything." The entire room fell so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Then Adrian pulled a small black ring box from his pocket. It was so simple. A delicate, elegant solitaire diamond ring, catching the soft, warm light. Not the kind of massive rock meant for the front page of the Manhattan tabloids, but the kind a man chooses when he's finally done turning love into a performance. Nora Hale. For the first time since I'd known him, Adrian's voice trembled. This time. Do you really want to marry me? The tears came almost instantly. Not because of the ring, not because of the mansion, not because Adrian Whitmore was a billionaire, but because, for once, someone was actually asking me what I wanted. Instead of making the choice for me, I took a step toward him and gave a soft nod. Yeah. My voice caught in my throat, this time. I choose you. Adrian closed his eyes for a few seconds, looking like he was finally able to breathe again after all these years. Then, he pulled me into a slow embrace. Not too tight, not possessive, just a man who was finally no longer afraid to love someone. The wedding took place nearly 2 months later in a small church out in Connecticut. No media, no Manhattan high society guests, no cameras, only the people who truly mattered to us. Marcus cried even more than I did when the priest read our vows. Emily was shaking so hard she dropped her bouquet right before walking down the aisle as my bridesmaid. Walter stood outside the church doors, chain-smoking, because he was so overwhelmed with emotion. Even Eleanor was quietly wiping away tears when she thought no one was watching. I wore a simple wedding dress made of soft, white satin, no couture label, no thousands of glittering gems stitched into the fabric. Adrian stood at the end of the aisle in a classic black suit, watching me with a look that made my heart ache in the most tender way possible. As I neared the altar, my father suddenly gripped my hand tighter. He had aged so much in just a few months. His hair was grayer, his shoulders were slumped. But for the first time in so long, his eyes didn't look away from mine. Nora, my father's voice cracked. I turned to look at him. My father burst into tears, right there in the middle of the narrow aisle, bathed in the pale winter sunlight. You were never meant to be used as a bargaining chip. My throat tightened, completely blocking my voice. I'm so sorry it took me this long to realize that. I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. And for the first time in years, I truly hugged my father. There was no more anger, no more resentment, only a deep sadness for everything our family had lost to fear and silence. As I walked up to Adrian, the sunlight filtering through the stained glass window behind the altar cast a soft, warm glow over his shoulders. Adrian looked at me for a long moment, as if he still couldn't quite believe that the person standing in front of him had finally chosen to stay. And for the first time since entering this marriage, which had started as a mere contract, I realized the most beautiful thing wasn't just that we loved each other. It was that neither of us had to live in constant fear of being abandoned anymore. Victoria Hayes was sentenced 18 months after our wedding. It was pouring rain in Manhattan on the morning of her final sentencing. News of the financial fraud at Hayes Freight dominated every major business outlet for weeks. The articles that once praised Victoria as a powerhouse of the logistics industry were replaced by cold headlines detailing embezzlement, market manipulation, and abuse of power. I didn't attend the trial, not because I was afraid to face her, but because I no longer wanted my life to revolve around old wounds. Adrian didn't go either. That morning, we sat in the kitchen at Whitmore Estate, eating the pancakes Marcus had just made, while a cold October rain streaked across the window panes. Adrian's phone buzzed constantly with emails from the press and the investment board. He simply flipped his phone over, continuing to slice strawberries onto my plate as if that were far more important. Close to noon, Mason called. Adrian kept the call brief. Then he put the phone down. It's over. I was silent for a few seconds. How long? 3 years probation. And heavy financial penalties seizing all her external investment assets. He looked down at his coffee cup. Victoria is also barred from managing any business in the future. The kitchen fell completely quiet. Rain continued to stream down the glass. I always thought I'd feel some sense of triumph when this day came, but in the end, all I felt was tired. tired of how far someone could go and how many years they could waste simply out of fear of losing the life they had built. 2 weeks later, Victoria sent me a handwritten letter. Not an email, not through a lawyer. A real letter written on cream-colored paper. Her handwriting was as elegant and cold as ever. There was one passage I couldn't forget. Perhaps I lived too long in a world where everything has a price, and I forgot that people are not contracts. I spent a long time in the library reading that letter over and over. Then I folded it up. It wasn't complete forgiveness. But I didn't want to carry that anger with me for the rest of my life anymore. The Whitmore Foundation was established in the early spring of the following year. The initial idea came from Adrian, but it was Eleanor who named the foundation. The foundation provided legal and financial support for women forced into economic dependency or financial control in their homes. On opening day, the Manhattan press tried to turn it into the usual billionaire romance story. Adrian declined almost every interview. He hated turning other people's pain into a media tool. In the end, there was only a very short article in the New York Journal. The Whitmore Foundation opened with the goal of helping women have the right to choose their own lives without being traded as the price of their own existence. I stared at those words for a long time, because for the first time in my life, my story was no longer just a wound. It became something that helped others feel a little less alone. The Whitmore estate completely transformed after a year. It no longer had the cold feel of a 5-star hotel. The side living room was now filled with books and colorful woolen blankets I bought on a whim every weekend. Walter had turned the backyard garden into a place where everyone would sit and drink tea in the late afternoon. Emily graduated from Columbia with an outstanding law degree and became the first legal advisor for the Whitmore Foundation. Marcus still baked cinnamon apple pies every weekend, even though the doctor forbid him from eating too much sugar. Even Eleanor started turning on the TV in the evenings, instead of keeping the entire house in absolute silence like before. One early winter evening, as I walked down to the kitchen near 8 o'clock, I heard laughter echoing from inside. Marcus was arguing with Walter about New York pizza being better than Chicago pizza. Emily, who had just gotten home from work and was still in her business suit, was eating noodles right at the kitchen island. Adrian stood by the espresso machine, his shirt sleeves rolled up, reading emails while listening to everyone talk. The scene was so ordinary, yet so beautiful. He turned around when he saw me walk in. "You're just in time." Marcus pointed to the large pot of pasta on the stove. "I'm about to fight Walter because he wants to add more cheese." Walter immediately protested. "It's art." The whole kitchen burst into laughter. I stood at the doorway for a few seconds, suddenly remembering the Whitmore estate on the very first day I arrived. Silent, perfect, cold like a museum. Now, this place was full of voices, filled with the aroma of food, full of unfinished conversations, full of the traces of real life. Adrian pulled out the chair next to him for me to sit. "No grand dining room tonight?" I looked toward the dining room in the distance, bathed in warm, golden light. Adrian set down his espresso cup and naturally pulled the pasta to the center of the table. He preferred eating here. I looked at the man in front of me for a long time. Adrian Whitmore was still the CEO of the largest 5-star hotel empire in America, still featured on Forbes, still signing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But now, he was also the man who argued over curtain colors with his wife, ate late-night burgers in the car, and sat in the kitchen having dinner with the staff like a real family. Some changes don't make a sound. They just quietly save someone from loneliness. That night, after everyone had gone up to their rooms, Adrian and I stayed in the kitchen for a long time. Outside the glass door, the first snow of the season began to fall over the gardens of the Whitmore estate. The warm yellow light, reflecting off the marble countertops, looked much softer and warmer than it used to. Adrian reached out to adjust the woolen blanket over my shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" I rested my head gently on his shoulder. I was just thinking, how strange it is. What is? A marriage that started as a business transaction, ending up as the safest place I've ever known. Adrian was silent for a few seconds, then kissed my hair gently, maybe because, for the first time, we both stopped seeing love as something we have to earn through pain. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly. The Whitmore estate was enveloped in the soft, gentle peace of a real home, and finally, I understood the most important lesson that life takes so long to teach us. Mature love doesn't force you to make yourself smaller just to be kept around. It makes you feel like you can finally be yourself and still be allowed to stay. If this story touched you in some way, remember that sometimes the most precious thing in life isn't money, power, or luxurious mansions. It is the feeling of finally being with someone who makes you feel like you no longer have to pretend to be someone else just to be loved. And maybe out there are still many people just like Adrian and Nora, people who grew up with deep wounds, living so long in the fear of being abandoned that they forgot they too deserve to be loved with pure sincerity. If you've had to be strong for too long, if you've always felt like the one who has to sacrifice, or if you ever thought love only comes with conditions, I hope this story reminds you of one thing. Someone who truly loves you will never make you feel like you have to pay a price to stay in their life. They will make you feel safe just being who you are. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. And remember, dignity is not a privilege. It is a fundamental right. Her family sold her to a 5-star hotel empire to save themselves from a $41 million